It's about mutability, about change, about transition. Transitioning from one state to another, from like a dream to wakefulness, or from night into day. And it's also about our relationship with the dead, how we relate to the memory of the dead.
The first time I ever heard of Jóhann Jóhannsson was in 2011, when the last track from his album IBM 1401, A User's Manual, was used in the trailer for the Jonathan Liebesman's sci-fi action movie Battle Los Angeles.
Cause I loved her and she didn't love back. The sun's gone dim and the sky's turned black. Cause I
To this day, that song still gives me chills up and down my spine every time I listen to it. Ultimately, the film that Jóhannsson's song was used to promote the supposed epicness of turned out to be a dreary, emptily bombastic and blandly forgettable bore. But it did do one thing right. Its trailer introduced me to the gorgeous, melancholic, otherworldly sound of Icelandic composer Jóhann Jóhannsson. From that point on, I delved deep into his discography, discovering for myself the riches of ostensibly genred classical albums he had produced, and the unique concepts he based so much of his work around. The aforementioned IBM 1401 is named after a decades-old variable word-length decimal computer, with the idea of the album being described as a personal response to technology and its inevitable obsolescence. This personal response was inspired by the sound of a singing IBM computer that was recorded onto an analog reel-to-reel tape machine found in the attic of Jóhann Jóhannsson, Jóhannsson's father, who was chief maintenance engineer of one of Iceland's first computers. Thus, it's clear that this piece of work was not only a neoclassical treatise on the strange poignancy in the idea of machines left behind in the wake of technological progress, but that it was also a monumental sonic tribute to Jóhannsson's father. Incidentally, the 1401 was apparently known as the Model T Ford of the computer industry, which may or may not be coincidentally ironic, as Jóhannsson's following album, Fordlandia, was conceptually based upon the story of the eponymous small American town come rubber plantation project that Henry Ford foolishly attempted to create in the middle of the Amazonian jungle in the 1920s. This bizarre true-life tale is a perfect encapsulation of the themes of capitalistic greed, cultural insensitivity, and, as Jóhannsson primarily focused on, the idea of a failed utopia. It's no surprise then that these two back-to-back albums were intended as part of a proposed trilogy of pieces that dealt with technology and industrial archaeology. Like John Williams crossed with Isaac Asimov, Jóhannsson had an almost science fiction writer's eye, or rather ear, for the ideas he toyed around with in his music, seeming, as he did, to have had somewhat of an obsession with the ways humanity and technology overlapped, and how each organism affected the other over time. My favourite of his albums that I devoured in his pre-composer days, his debut solo work Engleborn, beautifully conveys this theme of the interlinking of man and machine. You can hear what I mean with the album's reoccurring song Odi et Amo. The vocals, performed by Jóhannsson, are a recitation of the Latin poem Catullus 85, written by the Roman poet Gaius Valerius Catullus. Odi et amo, quare id faciem fortasse requiris, nescio, sed fieri sentio et exclusio. I hate and I love. Why do I do this, perhaps you ask? I do not know, but I feel it's happening and I am tortured. Regarding how this song came to be, Jóhannsson said, "This was a happy accident. I'd written the music and wanted a computerized countertenor vocal singing a Latin text and was looking through a collection of Latin poetry when I remembered this poem from college and it did fit the melody perfectly. What I really like about it is the harsh contrast of the computer voice and the strings, the alchemy of total opposites." But then, along came Denis Villeneuve. In the 3 films they worked together on, in the space of just a few short years, the Villeneuve-Jóhannsson director-composer partnership was rapidly becoming one of cinema's all-time great director-composer matches made in heaven, alongside Alfred Hitchcock and Bernard Herrmann, or Darren Aronofsky and Clint Mansell, or J.J. Abrams and Michael Giacchino, or Christopher Nolan and David Julian and Hans Zimmer, and or Steven Spielberg and John Williams. Jóhannsson's first soundtrack for Villeneuve was with the latter's brilliant crime drama, Prisoners.
It was kind of clear very early on what kind of instrumentation I wanted to use, and it was clear that we needed an orchestra and strings would be very important, but very kind of cold strings. We didn't want to milk the emotion. It's not about, like heavy vibrato and really kind of emotional string music. Not at all. We tried to keep it very cold.
And while that soundtrack is excellent in its own right and is highly recommended, the scores Jóhannsson composed for Villeneuve's next 2 films are the ones that will stay with me forever. Let's start with Sicario. Sicario begins with a distant, palpitating beat steadily and insistently rising up through the sound mix, inching towards total dominance over your eardrums, like a shark methodically stalking you through the murky depths, the intensity ratcheting ever tighter like a thumbscrew over your pulse. Using the deep symphonic texture of his orchestra, dominated by the ferocious, bone-shaking rumble of an arsenal of double basses and cellos, including some remarkable solo cello work from fellow Icelandic musician Hilda Gudnadottir, all of which is then twisted and distorted in his usual digital post-production manipulation. Jóhannsson guides us through the horrors of the world of Sicario via his utterly blood-curdling, nightmarish soundscape, one which actually growls and snarls and wails, making you, as a viewer, feel as though you're trapped in the belly of a terrible beast from the bowels of hell, where you can hear it marching ever onwards on its endless journey towards creating utter cataclysmic devastation as it devours anything and anyone that stands in its path. It's terrifyingly intense, nail-bitingly suspenseful, and in the end deeply mournful for the tragedy of so many lives taken in the vicious cycle of death and destruction that the war on drugs has created, and mournful for the many lives yet still to be lost as the violence spreads like a virus from one generation to the next. Jóhannsson's score for Arrival, however, is an entirely different beast altogether. What he created for the grounded, intellectual, yet emphatically heartfelt sci-fi tale at the centre of Arrival bears some similarities to his Sicario sound. The relatively stripped-back orchestra, many of the same musicians, including Gudnadottir, the frequent blasts of skin-prickling explosions of noise. But whereas those explosions of noise in Sicario were all about conveying the feeling of tension, horror, and the dark, unsettling moral ambiguities of that story, Arrival's explosions of noise aren't just about showcasing the feeling of the uneasy menace of the aliens' sudden, mysterious appearance and the initial unknowability of their intentions. They're also inflected with the feeling of overwhelming awe the human characters experience as they first enter the heptapod's shell-shaped craft, as though passing through the gates of a potentially all-powerful being. The thing that really sets these two scores apart, though, is Jóhannsson having brought to Arrival's infinitely more uplifting story this ethereal, vibrant sense of sincere curiosity and wonder, achieved primarily by taking the full-blooded warmth of the orchestra and then adding and mixing in a fascinated emphasis on the sound of human vocalizations.
I did a session here in Berlin in a studio with a 16-track tape loop, and then I asked Robert Aeki Obrilo, who's a frequent collaborator of mine, and I asked him to sing a series of notes over this drone. When Rob was singing those, that first idea, those first few notes, I really felt that there was something magical happening. So I took out my iPhone and I recorded it, and I sent it to Denis, and it was only like 10 seconds. And Denis responded almost immediately, saying, "This is fantastic. You have to send me a 5-minute version of this."
Normally, whenever a choir is utilised on a film soundtrack, even though most audiences might not know or hear otherwise, the singers are given actual lyrics to perform, be they in English or Latin or any other language. For example, in The Matrix Revolutions, the climactic fight scene is scored with the track Neo Dameron, wherein composer Don Davis isn't having his choir sing any old random notes that just sound epic. The choir are singing in Sanskrit, reciting extracts from the Upanishads, ancient texts that contain some of the central philosophical concepts and ideas of Hinduism. Whereas with Arrival, Jóhannsson had his choir, the Theatre of Voices, do something more akin to the von Lenska or Hopelandic language Sigur Rós lead singer John C. Bergerson, another fellow Icelander, uses in his music, this made-up language being a form of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues. However, perhaps the more accurate description of what Jóhannsson had his choir sing was idioglossia, a style of speaking and singing most well known for being used by Elizabeth Fraser in Cocteau Twins. And even more famously by Lisa Gerrard in her work on numerous film soundtracks and in the band Dead Can Dance. Essentially, idioglossia is a semi-comprehensible, idiosyncratic, made-up language that is unique to each person that speaks it. In the case of Gerard, she said of her own particular idioglossic language, "I sing in the language of the heart. It's an invented language that I've had for a very long time. I believe I started singing in it when I was about 12, and I believed that I was speaking to God when I sang in that language." Add to all of that his electronically processed sampling of the avant-garde vocal chirrups he sampled from Joan LaBarbera's song Erin, and altogether with these techniques, Jóhannsson superbly managed to musically express a rival's themes about the importance of communication, the power of language, the impact of the passage of time, and what it means to be human. Those last two ideas, coupled with Jóhannsson's career-long preoccupation with using his music and the tools used in creating his music to explore the intersection between mankind and technology, makes it easy to see how well suited he was to the material of Villeneuve's following film Blade Runner 2049. And originally, Jóhannsson and Villeneuve were working together for the fourth time in a row in their creative partnership for almost the entire production process of the film. They both had phenomenally big shoes to fill, Villeneuve following in Ridley Scott's directorial footsteps, and Jóhannsson following the supremely influential score Vangelis produced for the original film. But considering their sterling track records up until then, both together and individually, there was no reason to think that they wouldn't be up to the task. And when Blade Runner 2049 was eventually released, any and all fears were quickly alleviated, because even if the box office profits weren't what the studio was hoping for, the film nonetheless received a rapturous response of near-universal acclaim, with many praising its acting, story, Villeneuve's direction, Roger Deakins' cinematography, and the teeth-rattling electronic score. Except, Jóhannsson didn't compose the score. In fact, just over a few months before the film's release, Jóhannsson and Villeneuve parted ways in a seeming disparity of creative vision, contractual obligations binding both from commenting further. And in July 2017, Hans Zimmer and Benjamin Wolfitch, who had also worked together extensively that year on Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, were hired to replace Jóhannsson and build an entire new score from the ground up in just 3 months. I love Zimmer and Wolfitch's Blade Runner soundtrack truly, madly, deeply, but it's hard to not imagine what might have been had Jóhannsson gotten to see his musical vision for the film through to its completion. We may never know how and why he couldn't remain on Blade Runner, as much as we may never know how and why his life was cut so brutally, stunningly short. Before his passing in February of 2018, the last 4 films Jóhannsson will have ever scored are all, oddly and coincidentally, films beginning with M. The first of the 3 to come out in 2018 is the James Marsh film The Mercy, starring Colin Firth. The second is the Nicolas Cage film Mandy, from Beyond the Black Rainbow director Panos Cosmatos. And the third, which will be Jóhannsson's final, now posthumous film, is Lion director Garth Davis's Mary Magdalene, starring Rooney Mara and Joaquin Phoenix. But for the fourth of these M movies, we have to go back to 2017 and Darren Aronofsky's polarizingly controversial film Mother, which doesn't contain much in the way of an actual score at all, save for this occasional rattle of what sounds like a tambourine throughout key moments in the movie, ratcheting up suspense in the subtlest of subtle ways. But It does provide a fitting final reminder of Jóhannsson's talent and his dedication to making the best works of art he possibly could, even at his own expense. To end with a quote from one last fellow Icelandic peer, Ólafur Arnalds. He had spent a year writing the score, and at some point realised that the film was better with no music at all. He proceeded to convince Darren to delete everything. It takes a real selfless artist to do that, to realise the piece is better without you. The score needed to be written first in order to realise that it was redundant. So in my view, Mother still has a score by Jóhann. The score is just silence. Deafening, genius silence.
Yeah, it's been part of my life for a few years now, and almost like, you know, it feels hard to let go in some way because it doesn't feel finished. You know, somehow the things never seem finished. I mean, that's true for most projects. You never really feel that something is finished. You know, you just have to put a full stop somewhere. You know.